Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the address where destiny decides to knock. Rain drifted across Manhattan like silver threads pulled through the night, soft enough to blur the skyline but heavy enough to send strangers rushing beneath awnings and subway entrances. Claire Dawson tightened her grip on the handle of a navy umbrella as she hurried down Lexington Avenue after another exhausting evening at the architecture firm. The office lights had finally disappeared behind her, leaving only reflections of neon signs trembling across rain-soaked sidewalks. She adjusted the leather strap of her messenger bag, careful not to splash through puddles that had already swallowed the painted crosswalks. Around her, taxis hissed through shallow water while impatient horns echoed between glass towers, yet the city somehow felt quieter than usual, wrapped beneath the steady rhythm of rain. She noticed him only because everyone else seemed determined to avoid him. A tall man stood alone beside a closed flower shop with no umbrella, no jacket hood, and no sign of frustration. He simply watched the rain as though he had all the time in the world. His charcoal overcoat was damp across the shoulders, dark hair brushed neatly back despite the weather, and his calm expression contrasted sharply with the frantic pace surrounding him. Claire slowed for only a second before continuing forward. Half a block later she looked back. He was still there, still waiting. The traffic signal changed, releasing another wave of hurried pedestrians between them. Something about the scene tugged at her conscience. Maybe it was the way everyone walked around him as though he had become invisible. Maybe it was because she remembered being stranded in a storm herself years earlier when nobody had stopped. Before she could talk herself out of it, Claire turned around. The stranger noticed her approach only when the umbrella stretched over both of them, sheltering him from the rain without a word. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Water continued tapping softly against the fabric overhead, while the city rushed past without slowing. "Looks like you could use half of this," Claire said with an awkward smile. The man glanced upward before meeting her eyes. His expression remained composed, almost unreadable, yet there was unmistakable gratitude hidden behind the quietness. "You realize New Yorkers usually keep walking," he replied, his voice calm and low. Claire laughed softly. Maybe that's exactly why someone shouldn't. A faint smile appeared for less than a heartbeat before disappearing again. "Thank you." They walked together toward the next intersection, neither asking unnecessary questions. Claire could tell he carried himself differently from anyone she had met before, not because of expensive shoes or the tailored coat, although both were impossible to ignore, but because people unconsciously made room for him without realizing they were doing it. Cyclists slowed. Even a delivery driver stepped aside with a polite nod before continuing. Claire assumed he was some successful executive accustomed to respect. She never imagined anything beyond that. The rain intensified, drumming louder against the umbrella. Wind pushed cool air through the streets, carrying the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe mixed with wet concrete and blooming flowers from the shop behind them. "You're headed east?" he asked. "Brooklyn," Claire answered. "Worth it?" She considered the question. "Depends on the day." He nodded once as though storing the answer somewhere important. They reached the subway entrance where Claire normally turned underground, but she hesitated after seeing the overcrowded staircase. "Actually," she admitted, "I'm only a few blocks from my bus stop. I'll keep walking, then allow me to return the favor someday." She smiled politely. "Just help the next person standing in the rain." Another almost invisible smile crossed his face. Perhaps. They continued another block together before Claire stopped beside the narrow street leading toward her apartment neighborhood. "This is me." He looked beyond her shoulder for only an instant, quietly observing the brownstone buildings lining the street, the bakery glowing warmly on the corner, the blue mailbox beside the pharmacy, the address numbers mounted beneath old iron balconies. His eyes lingered no longer than anyone else's might have, yet they seemed to absorb every detail without effort. Claire never noticed. "Take care," she said. "You too, Claire," she blinked. "I don't remember telling you my name." He looked briefly toward the architectural sketches peeking from her messenger bag where an employee identification badge reflected beneath the streetlight. "Your badge," he answered with calm certainty. Claire laughed at herself, slightly embarrassed. "Right, that makes a lot more sense. Safe travels." She waved goodbye before disappearing toward the quiet residential street, never seeing the black luxury sedan that rolled silently to the curb moments later. The rear passenger door opened before the stranger reached it. Inside, another man in a tailored suit waited without speaking. The stranger glanced once more toward the street where Claire had vanished beneath the rain before calmly closing the car door behind him. "Did you need the address?" the driver finally asked. The man looked through rain-speckled glass toward the fading lights of the neighborhood. "No," he replied. "I already memorized it." Unfortunately for Claire, less than a mile away, another vehicle had already begun driving slowly through the very same neighborhood. Its passengers carrying a photograph they intended to match with a home before sunrise. Morning arrived beneath pale gray clouds that still clung to the Manhattan skyline, leaving the streets washed clean as though the city had quietly erased the previous night's storm. Claire Dawson balanced a paper cup of coffee in one hand, while weaving through the familiar rhythm of commuters, cyclists, and impatient delivery trucks. The strange encounter beneath the umbrella should have faded into another ordinary memory, yet she found herself replaying the conversation in unexpected moments. It was not because the man had been mysterious. New York was full of mysterious people. It was because he had listened without rushing, spoken without pretending, and somehow made 30 seconds of silence feel unusually comfortable. By the time she reached the architecture firm, the feeling had almost disappeared beneath blueprints, client revisions, and endless meetings. Her desk overlooked a narrow avenue where construction cranes stretched above neighboring rooftops, their steel frames disappearing into low clouds. Hours passed in careful concentration until a receptionist appeared carrying a long white box wrapped with a dark navy ribbon. "Delivery for Claire," she announced with a curious smile. Several co-workers looked up from their desks. Claire frowned. "For me?" The receptionist checked the label again before placing the package gently on the drafting table. "No sender listed." Curious whispers drifted across the office while Claire untied the ribbon. Inside rested a bouquet of fresh white lilies mixed with small blue irises, arranged with remarkable precision. Nestled beside them was a simple cream-colored card. It contained only 6 neatly printed words. "Thank you for sharing the umbrella. Nothing more." No signature, no phone number, no explanation. Claire stared at the message for several seconds before quietly smiling. "Secret admirer?" one co-worker teased from across the room. Claire shook her head. "Definitely not." "Then who sends flowers without a name?" another asked. She laughed softly. "Someone who apparently remembers good manners." The conversation drifted away, but Claire kept glancing toward the bouquet throughout the afternoon. Whoever had arranged the delivery had somehow located her office after only one brief meeting. She reminded herself that her employee identification badge displayed the company name. It would not have been difficult for someone determined enough. Still, something about the anonymous gesture felt unusual, not intrusive, simply deliberate. As evening approached, she left the office carrying the flowers carefully against her coat, determined to brighten her apartment with them. The subway station buzzed with the usual after-work crowd, yet she decided to walk several extra blocks before catching her bus. The cool air cleared her thoughts, while storefront windows reflected the fading daylight across polished sidewalks. She paused outside a neighborhood bookstore, admiring a display of classic American novels, when movement across the street caught her attention. Parked beside the curb sat a familiar black luxury sedan. She recognized it only because she had glimpsed it briefly the previous night through the falling rain. Before she could study it more closely, traffic rolled between them. When the line of vehicles finally cleared, the sedan had disappeared. Claire frowned for only a moment before convincing herself that thousands of identical cars existed in Manhattan. It meant nothing. Less than 2 blocks away, the same sedan waited behind another row of parked vehicles where it remained almost invisible beneath the evening shadows. Inside, Rafael Marino watched the entrance of the bookstore through lightly tinted glass. He did not step outside. He did not speak. Beside him sat an older associate, quietly reviewing messages on a tablet before lowering the screen. "The search is expanding," the associate said. "Another neighborhood was checked this afternoon." Rafael kept his eyes on the sidewalk where Claire now continued walking with the bouquet resting gently against her arm. Any indication they reached her street? Not yet. A brief silence settled inside the vehicle. "Good." The associate studied him carefully before asking, "Should we relocate her before they find it?" Raphael answered without hesitation. "Not until we know exactly who is looking." The associate nodded once and returned to his tablet without another question. Claire reached her apartment building just before sunset. Children laughed in the courtyard nearby, while an elderly couple watered flowers on a neighboring balcony. The peaceful neighborhood seemed completely untouched by whatever invisible concern lingered elsewhere in the city. She unlocked her apartment, placed the bouquet inside a glass vase, and opened the windows to welcome the cool evening breeze. The lilies immediately filled the room with a clean, comforting fragrance. She smiled, thinking briefly about the stranger who had chosen gratitude instead of conversation. Outside, headlights briefly swept across her curtains before disappearing again. Unfortunately for Claire, she never noticed another vehicle slowing near the corner. Two men inside compared the numbers on nearby brownstones with a printed photograph before quietly driving forward. Still searching for an address they believed they had not yet found, the following afternoon unfolded beneath a brilliant blue sky that made the previous night's storm feel almost imaginary. Yet Claire Dawson could not ignore the growing feeling that tiny coincidences were beginning to collect around her like scattered puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. The bouquet of lilies remained fresh beside the window in her apartment, filling the room with a gentle fragrance that lingered even after she left for work. She smiled each time she passed them, reminding herself that not every mystery needed an explanation. Some people simply knew how to say thank you. By lunchtime, the pace inside the architecture firm had slowed enough for Claire to step outside with a sandwich and a sketchbook. Bryant Park offered a welcome break from computer screens and conference rooms, its green lawn dotted with office workers escaping fluorescent lights for an hour of fresh air. She found an empty bench beneath a tall maple tree and opened her notebook, absent-mindedly sketching the curved roofline of the public library across the street. A soft breeze turned the pages while distant sirens blended into the steady soundtrack of Manhattan. Across the park, a young mother struggled to gather grocery bags while holding the hand of a little boy who seemed determined to chase every pigeon in sight. One paper bag split open without warning, sending fruit rolling across the walkway. Claire closed her notebook immediately and hurried over. Within seconds, she had gathered scattered apples and oranges, while another passerby picked up the remaining groceries. The grateful mother laughed with visible relief. "Thank you. New York usually moves too fast for moments like this." Claire handed back the last apple with a warm smile. Sometimes people just need someone to stop for 30 seconds. She continued walking toward the corner cafe without realizing another pair of eyes had quietly observed the entire exchange from inside a parked vehicle. Rafael Marino lowered the newspaper resting across his lap, but did not step outside. His expression remained calm, although the smallest hint of approval crossed his face before disappearing again. "She does it every time," the driver remarked quietly. Rafael continued watching Claire disappear into the cafe. "Every time?" Yesterday she helped an elderly man carry groceries across Atlantic Avenue before work. Today this. Raphael remained silent for several moments. "Kindness becomes predictable," he finally said. "Predictable people are easier to find." The driver understood immediately that the observation carried more concern than admiration. Meanwhile, Claire ordered an iced coffee before beginning the walk back toward the office. Halfway across the intersection, a courier rounded the corner faster than expected, forcing several pedestrians to step back. Claire instinctively froze, unsure which direction to move. Before she could react, another pedestrian gently guided her backward by one careful step. The bicycle swept harmlessly past only inches away before continuing down the avenue. "You should watch the bike lanes," a familiar voice said. Claire turned in surprise. The stranger from the rain stood beside her, his charcoal suit replacing the overcoat she remembered, sunlight catching the silver edge of his wristwatch. "You again," she said with an amused laugh. "Either New York is much smaller than everyone claims, or you have remarkable timing, perhaps both." She studied him for a moment, before smiling. "I suppose I should thank you this time." "You already did." Her expression softened with understanding. "The flowers?" He offered the slightest nod. "I hope they arrived safely. They were beautiful." For a brief moment, neither of them hurried to end the conversation. Office workers flowed around them while taxis rolled through the intersection, yet the city seemed strangely distant. "I never asked your name," Claire admitted. "Raphael." "Just Raphael? For now," she laughed quietly. "Fair enough." A comfortable silence settled between them before Claire glanced toward the office tower across the street. "I should get back before my boss starts wondering if architecture suddenly became an outdoor profession." Raphael looked toward the building, then back at her. "You should go." Something in the way he said it sounded less like casual conversation and more like certainty. Claire smiled politely before crossing the street, turning once to wave. Raphael remained exactly where she had left him until she disappeared inside the revolving doors. Only then did he return to the waiting sedan. Less than a mile away, another black vehicle entered Claire's neighborhood at walking speed. Inside, two unfamiliar men studied a folded city map covered with handwritten notes. One tapped a finger against a brownstone addresses before quietly shaking his head. "Not this street," he muttered. They continued driving, unaware that another team had already noticed their search. High above the avenue, security cameras silently recorded both vehicles passing through the neighborhood within minutes of each other, preserving details that Claire would not learn existed until much later. As afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Midtown, she returned to her desk believing she had simply experienced another unlikely coincidence, never realizing that invisible circles were beginning to close around a life that had once felt perfectly ordinary. The rest of the week settled into a rhythm that should have felt ordinary, yet Claire Dawson could not shake the strange certainty that the city had quietly become smaller around her. Every familiar street seemed to hold an unexpected reminder of the man she had met beneath the rain. She told herself it was simple coincidence. Manhattan was crowded, but people often crossed paths more than they realized. Even so, when Friday evening arrived, she welcomed an invitation from a co-worker to visit a newly opened cafe in Soho, hoping a different neighborhood would finally clear her thoughts. Warm amber lights spilled across polished wooden floors while quiet jazz drifted through the room. Large front windows reflected the golden glow of sunset onto damp sidewalks left behind by another brief afternoon shower. Claire ordered a cappuccino and settled near the window with a sketchbook balanced beside her cup, absent-mindedly drawing building facades that lined the narrow streets outside. The cafe gradually filled with conversations and laughter until the empty chair across from her moved slightly. "May I?" a familiar voice asked. Claire looked up, surprised but no longer startled. Raphael stood there wearing a dark navy jacket instead of the formal suit she had seen before, looking almost ordinary despite carrying the same calm confidence that always seemed to separate him from everyone nearby. "You have remarkable timing," she said with an amused smile. "Or terrible luck. Which one do you prefer?" he asked. "I have not decided yet." He smiled faintly before sitting across from her after she nodded. For several moments they simply watched the city through the wide windows while baristas steamed milk behind the counter. Unlike most conversations between strangers, there was no uncomfortable pressure to impress each other. Claire found the silence unexpectedly peaceful. "Do you always carry a sketchbook?" Raphael finally asked. She turned it toward him, revealing pencil drawings of old brick buildings, bridges, and storefronts. "Architecture pays the bills," she said. "Sketching reminds me why I chose it." He studied the page with genuine attention instead of offering polite compliments. "You notice details other people overlook." Claire laughed softly. "That sounds familiar, does it?" "Someone else I met recently said something similar without actually saying it." His expression remained unreadable, yet there was warmth behind his eyes that had not been there during the storm. Perhaps they were right. A server arrived with fresh coffee for Raphael even though he had not placed an order. Claire raised an eyebrow. "You come here often?" "Occasionally. Often enough that they already know what you drink. Old habits." She smiled without pressing further. Outside, twilight settled over Soho as streetlights flickered to life one by one. A musician across the street began playing a slow jazz melody on a saxophone, the notes drifting through the open cafe door with the evening breeze. Claire rested her chin lightly against one hand. "Can I ask you something? Of course. What do you actually do?" Raphael looked toward the street before answering. "I manage several businesses." "That sounds intentionally vague." "Sometimes vague is accurate." She laughed again. "You really do answer questions without answering them." "You noticed. I noticed details too." For the first time his smile lingered long enough to soften the seriousness in his face. It made him seem younger than she had first imagined. Their conversation wandered through architecture, favorite neighborhoods, childhood memories of New York winters, and the strange comfort of walking through the city after midnight when everything finally slowed down. Claire realized she had spent nearly an hour speaking with someone whose last name she still did not know, yet the conversation felt easier than many she had shared with long-time acquaintances. Unfortunately for her, she never noticed the man seated near the back corner of the cafe, lowering a newspaper just enough to photograph Raphael through the reflection in the window. Less than 10 seconds later, the photograph disappeared into an encrypted message sent from a phone that never rang. Raphael's attention shifted almost imperceptibly toward the glass, his eyes lingering on the reflection instead of the street beyond it. Claire followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual except passing pedestrians and the evening traffic. "Is everything all right?" she asked. He turned back with the same composed expression. "Yes." The answer arrived a fraction too quickly. She sensed he had noticed something, but chose not to explain it. Before she could ask another question, his phone vibrated once against the table. He glanced at the screen for less than a second before slipping it back into his pocket. "I have to leave." Claire looked disappointed despite herself. "Business?" Something like that. He stood, placing enough cash beside his untouched coffee to cover both drinks before she could protest. "Thank you for the conversation, Claire. I have a feeling we keep meeting before I can ask all the questions I think of. Perhaps that is why we keep meeting." He offered one final polite nod before disappearing through the cafe door into the fading evening light. Claire watched him cross the street until the crowd gradually swallowed him from view. She smiled to herself, unaware that the unidentified man in the corner quietly stood as well, leaving several minutes later with a single photograph that would soon convince someone else that Rafael Marino had developed an unexpected interest in a woman who believed their meetings were nothing more than extraordinary coincidences. Saturday arrived with crisp autumn air and brilliant sunlight washing over Manhattan, drawing crowds into parks, galleries, and weekend markets. Claire Dawson welcomed the slower pace after another demanding week at the architecture firm. Her closest friend had convinced her to visit an outdoor art exhibition along the Hudson River, insisting that spending an afternoon surrounded by paintings instead of blueprints would do wonders for her imagination. Rows of white tents stretched along the waterfront while local artists displayed colorful canvases, handcrafted sculptures, and photography that captured every corner of New York. Music drifted through the air from a nearby acoustic guitarist, blending with laughter, conversations, and the distant sound of ferries crossing the river. Claire wandered from booth to booth, occasionally stopping to admire watercolor cityscapes that reminded her why she had fallen in love with architecture in the first place. She eventually separated from her friend after becoming absorbed in a collection of charcoal sketches depicting forgotten neighborhoods across Brooklyn. As she reached into her bag to purchase a print, she realized her wallet was gone. She immediately checked every pocket before retracing her steps through the crowded exhibition. The pleasant afternoon suddenly felt much louder as dozens of unfamiliar faces moved past her in every direction. She searched beneath display tables, around benches, and near the food trucks where she had stopped earlier, but the wallet remained missing. Taking a slow breath, Claire reminded herself not to panic. The cash mattered far less than her identification cards and apartment keys. She approached a volunteer information booth, hoping someone might have turned it in. The young volunteer shook his head apologetically. "Nothing has been reported yet, but leave your phone number. We will call if someone finds it." Claire thanked him before stepping aside, trying to remember every place she had visited since arriving. Less than 100 feet away, Rafael Marino watched the situation unfold from beneath the shade of a riverside tree. He did not move immediately. Instead, he quietly observed the growing flow of visitors weaving through the exhibition. One of his associates approached without drawing attention. "We located the wallet," the associate said quietly. "A teenager found it near the photography tents and handed it to event security 5 minutes ago." Raphael nodded once. "Good. Should we return it?" "No." The associate looked slightly confused. Raphael continued watching Claire as she patiently thanked another volunteer despite receiving no useful information. If she learns every problem disappears because someone is watching, she will stop trusting her own instincts. The associate understood. Moments later, a security employee emerged from the administration tent, holding a familiar brown leather wallet. Claire's face brightened with visible relief as the employee confirmed her identification before handing it back. Everything remained inside exactly as she had left it. "Someone honest found it," the employee explained. "They did not leave a name." Claire smiled warmly. "Please thank them if they come back." She walked toward the waterfront, relieved more than she cared to admit. The river shimmered beneath the afternoon sun while sailboats drifted slowly across the water. She leaned against the railing for a moment, letting the breeze settle her thoughts. "Looks like New York surprised you again," Raphael said as he approached from behind. Claire turned, laughing in disbelief. "Either this city is incredibly small, or you somehow know every place I decide to visit. The exhibition seemed worth seeing. You have excellent timing." He glanced toward the river. "Did everything work out?" She held up the recovered wallet with a grateful smile. Apparently there are still good people around. There usually are. Claire studied him carefully. You sound very certain. Sometimes kindness simply travels farther than we expect. His answer lingered in her mind because it echoed something she herself had once believed. They began walking beside the waterfront, passing painters capturing the skyline in quick brushstrokes while families gathered around food vendors. For the first time, the conversation felt almost effortless. Claire learned that Raphael appreciated old buildings more than modern skyscrapers because, in his words, history could not be manufactured. Raphael listened as Claire described her dream of restoring forgotten neighborhoods instead of replacing them with taller glass towers. He never interrupted. He never checked his phone. He simply listened with an attention that had become increasingly rare in a city where everyone seemed to be rushing toward the next obligation. Unfortunately for Claire, another pair of eyes followed them from across the crowded promenade. A man wearing a baseball cap paused beside an ice cream stand while quietly speaking into a concealed earpiece. "The woman is with him again," he murmured. "Positive identification." Several blocks away, a black sport utility vehicle eased away from the curb without attracting attention. Raphael slowed almost imperceptibly as though sensing an invisible shift in the atmosphere. His gaze swept across reflections in nearby windows instead of looking directly behind him. Claire noticed only the brief silence that settled between them. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He offered the same calm expression she had seen before. "Not yet." The answer sounded strangely careful. Before Claire could ask another question, a distant church bell echoed across the river and somewhere beyond the crowded waterfront. People she had never met quietly changed their direction of travel after hearing that she had once again been seen beside the mysterious man whose real life remained completely hidden from her. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in quiet grey clouds that softened the skyline and slowed the usual pace of Manhattan. Claire Dawson welcomed the calm after the crowded art exhibition, deciding to spend the day exploring a historic neighborhood in Brooklyn where several restored warehouses had recently reopened as design studios and community spaces. She carried her camera instead of her sketchbook, hoping to capture old brick facades and cast iron details that might inspire her next project. The streets felt different from Midtown. Cafes spilled onto sidewalks, bicycles rolled past at an easy pace, and neighbors greeted one another as though the city had briefly remembered how to breathe. Claire wandered through narrow side streets until she discovered an abandoned industrial block overlooking the East River. One renovated warehouse displayed a temporary exhibit about preserving historic architecture, and she gladly stepped inside. Sunlight poured through enormous factory windows, illuminating exposed beams, weathered brick walls, and photographs comparing forgotten buildings with their restored versions. She moved slowly from one display to another, fascinated by the stories hidden inside ordinary places. Near the back of the gallery, she noticed a framed aerial photograph taken years earlier. A familiar corner bakery appeared in the lower edge of the image. The pharmacy beside it stood exactly where it remained today. Even the blue mailbox still occupied the same corner. Claire smiled in recognition. It was her own neighborhood. A small caption beneath the photograph explained that the surrounding district had once been scheduled for redevelopment before local preservation groups intervened. She leaned closer, tracing familiar streets with her eyes until she noticed several handwritten markings preserved in the archival image. Tiny circles surrounded a handful of addresses, including the block where her apartment building stood. "Interesting, is it not?" an elderly volunteer asked as he approached. Claire nodded. "I live nearby. I had no idea someone documented the neighborhood like this." The volunteer smiled warmly. "Old planning records. Some organizations became very interested in that area years ago. Nobody ever explained why." Before Claire could ask another question, another visitor requested the volunteer's assistance, leaving her alone with the photograph. She took one final look before continuing through the exhibit, unaware that the image had stirred a quiet memory inside someone else. Less than 200 yards away, Rafael Marino stood on the rooftop terrace of a neighboring building, speaking softly with the same trusted associate who had accompanied him throughout the week. Through discreet binoculars, the associate monitored the gallery entrance below. "She entered 20 minutes ago," he reported. Raphael remained silent for several seconds before asking, "Any movement from the other team?" Two unfamiliar vehicles passed the neighborhood before sunrise. They are searching methodically now. Raphael's expression did not change. "They are getting closer. Should we move first?" Raphael looked toward the river where ferries crossed beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. Not until we know what they believe they are looking for. The associate hesitated before lowering the binoculars. She is beginning to notice details. Raphael nodded once. She was always going to. Inside the gallery, Claire eventually stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, carrying a brochure about local restoration projects. As she rounded the corner toward a nearby coffee shop, she noticed a folded piece of paper lying beneath a park bench. Assuming someone had accidentally dropped it, she picked it up. The page appeared to be part of a city map covered with handwritten circles and arrows. Most of it made little sense until her eyes stopped on 3 blocks from her apartment. Before she could examine it more carefully, a middle-aged man hurried toward her, looking visibly relieved. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I believe that is mine." Claire smiled apologetically and handed him the folded map. "I found it under the bench, thank you very much." The man accepted it quickly before disappearing into the crowd with unusual haste. Claire watched him leave, puzzled by how tightly he held what appeared to be an ordinary street map. Something about the brief encounter unsettled her, although she could not explain why. She continued toward the coffee shop where she found an empty outdoor table overlooking the river. A server placed a steaming cup beside her just as a familiar shadow crossed the sidewalk. Raphael paused a few feet away. "May I join you?" Claire laughed softly. "At this point I am beginning to think the city is introducing us on purpose." He took the seat across from her, studying her expression with quiet attention. "You look distracted." She told him about the old neighborhood photograph and the strange map she had found only moments earlier. Raphael listened carefully without interrupting, but Claire noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes when she mentioned the circled street near her apartment. It disappeared so quickly she wondered whether she had imagined it. "Probably nothing," she concluded. "Most likely," Raphael replied gently, although his gaze drifted toward the busy sidewalk beyond the cafe where unfamiliar faces blended effortlessly into the afternoon crowd. What Claire could not possibly know was that, at that exact moment, 2 separate groups of people were searching the same neighborhood for entirely different reasons, and both believed time was beginning to run out. Monday arrived with a cold breeze rolling off the East River, carrying low clouds that turned the morning sky into muted shades of silver. Claire Dawson left her apartment earlier than usual, still thinking about the strange city map she had briefly held the day before. It should have been an insignificant moment, yet the image of those carefully marked streets refused to leave her mind. She walked toward the subway with a paper cup of coffee, warming her hands, noticing details she had ignored before. A dark sedan parked across from the bakery. 2 unfamiliar men standing beside a newspaper box without reading anything. A delivery truck idling longer than necessary near the corner pharmacy. Each scene looked perfectly ordinary by itself, but together they left behind a quiet feeling she could not explain. She dismissed the thought and continued toward Midtown, determined not to invent mysteries where none existed. The workday passed more slowly than expected. Meetings stretched into the afternoon while revisions covered nearly every blueprint on her desk. By the time the office emptied, rain had begun falling once again, lighter than the storm that had changed everything but steady enough to cover the sidewalks in shimmering reflections. Claire decided to walk instead of taking the subway immediately, hoping the cool air would clear her thoughts. She crossed several familiar blocks before noticing the lights inside a quiet bookstore that remained open later than most. The warm glow spilling through the windows felt inviting. She stepped inside and wandered through shelves filled with architecture, history, and photography. The store smelled of old paper and fresh coffee, creating the comforting silence that only bookstores seemed able to hold. She reached for a hardcover volume about restored New York landmarks at the exact moment another hand reached for the same book. She looked up and smiled despite herself. "You really do have remarkable timing," she said. Raphael Marino withdrew his hand with a faint smile. Perhaps the city enjoys repeating itself. They settled into a small reading corner near the back of the store where rain tapped softly against the windows. For several minutes they spoke about buildings, neighborhoods, and forgotten places that deserved a second chance. The conversation flowed naturally until Claire finally asked the question that had quietly followed her through every unexpected meeting. "Who are you really, Raphael?" The warmth in his expression faded, replaced by thoughtful silence. He looked toward the rain-covered window before answering, "Someone whose life is more complicated than it appears." Claire folded her hands around the warm coffee cup. You always say enough to make me curious, but never enough to understand. He nodded slightly. Because understanding comes with consequences. She searched his face, trying to decide whether he was joking. Nothing about him suggested humor. I found a strange map yesterday, she said carefully. It had circles around streets near my apartment. Then you reacted the moment I mentioned it. Raphael remained silent. You knew something. Yes, and you did not tell me. Not yet. Claire leaned back, frustration beginning to replace curiosity. I do not like being treated like someone who cannot handle the truth. This has never been about what you can handle. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable weight behind every word. Then tell me. Another long silence settled between them. Outside, headlights drifted through the rain while the bookstore grew quieter as customers gradually left for the evening. Finally, Raphael looked directly at her. Everything that has happened since the night we met has not been accidental. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. What does that mean? It means I knew your address before anyone else asked for it. She stared at him, remembering the brief glance he had taken toward her street before stepping into the waiting. You memorized it. He nodded once. Yes. Why? Because I believed someone else eventually would. The answer only deepened the mystery. Claire shook her head slowly. Who are you? Took a slow breath before speaking words he had clearly hoped never to say. My name is Rafael Marino. He paused only briefly. I oversee an organization that many people would call a mafia family. The bookstore seemed to fall completely silent. Claire searched his face for any sign that this was some elaborate misunderstanding, but she found only honesty. The composed confidence, the expensive cars, the men who seemed to appear without explanation, the way strangers instinctively stepped aside for him, every unexplained detail suddenly aligned into a picture she had never imagined. She stood slowly, unable to hide the disbelief in her eyes. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to know I will not lie to you anymore. Claire took a small step backward. Everything else was real? Every conversation? Yes, the umbrella? His expression softened, especially the umbrella. She looked toward the bookstore entrance where rain continued falling beyond the glass. Her thoughts raced faster than she could organize them. The kind stranger who had quietly thanked her with flowers was also a man connected to a dangerous world she had only seen in movies and newspaper headlines. She wanted to ask 100 more questions, yet none of them seemed large enough to bridge the distance that had suddenly opened between them. Without another word, she turned and walked into the rain, leaving Raphael standing alone among shelves of forgotten stories. Unfortunately for Claire, she never noticed the black sport utility vehicle parked across the street, nor the man inside quietly lowering a camera after capturing the exact moment she walked away from the most powerful secret she had ever unknowingly stepped into. Claire Dawson barely remembered the walk home. Rain blurred the streets into streaks of reflected light while every conversation she had shared with Raphael replayed inside her mind with entirely different meaning. The man who had thanked her with flowers, who had listened to her dreams without judgment, who had somehow appeared whenever life quietly drifted toward uncertainty, had just admitted that he belonged to a world she had spent her entire life avoiding. She reached her apartment, locked the door behind her, and stood motionless beside the window. The bouquet of white lilies still rested on the table exactly where she had placed it days earlier. Their fragrance filled the room with the same quiet comfort it always had, yet now they felt like evidence from a story she no longer understood. Sleep never truly arrived that night. Every passing set of headlights made her glance toward the street below. Every unfamiliar sound seemed louder than before. By morning she convinced herself the healthiest decision would be distance. She left for work earlier than usual, choosing different streets than she normally walked, hoping routine would slowly erase the confusion settling over her thoughts. Unfortunately, routine had already begun slipping away. Shortly after lunch, her office manager approached with an apologetic expression. "Claire, someone is here asking for you." She frowned. "Did they leave a name?" "No, they said it is about a neighborhood preservation survey." Curious but cautious, Claire walked to the reception area. A middle-aged man wearing a neat grey jacket stood beside the front desk holding a clipboard. He smiled politely. "Miss Dawson, we are updating historical property records for your neighborhood. Could you confirm your current address?" The request sounded ordinary, yet something about it immediately reminded her of the marked city map she had found in Brooklyn. "I thought those surveys arrived by mail," she replied. The man's smile barely changed. "This one is being completed in person. Claire hesitated just long enough for another receptionist to answer a ringing telephone. During the brief distraction, the visitor quietly studied the employee directory mounted behind the front desk before returning his attention to Claire. "Perhaps another time," she said politely. "I am busy today." Without waiting for another question, she thanked him and returned toward the elevators. She did not see the pleasant smile disappear from his face as soon as she turned away. Less than 10 minutes later, the man walked outside, removed a small earpiece from beneath his collar, and spoke only one sentence before disappearing into the afternoon crowd. She refused to confirm it. Several blocks away, Rafael Marino listened without interrupting. His trusted associate lowered the phone and looked across the conference table. "They know they are close." Rafael remained silent before standing and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lower Manhattan. "Bring the car," he said quietly. "We are done waiting." Meanwhile, Claire left the office later than expected, carrying rolled blueprints beneath one arm while evening sunlight reflected off rows of glass towers. She intended to catch the subway immediately, but a familiar black sedan stood parked across the street. Before she could decide whether to cross in the opposite direction, Rafael stepped onto the sidewalk. He made no attempt to block her path, he simply waited. Claire stopped several feet away. "I thought I made myself clear." His voice remained calm. "I know." "Then why are you here?" "Because today someone tried to confirm your address at work." Her expression changed instantly. "How did you know that?" "Because I have been trying to stay one step ahead of the people asking those questions." Claire folded her arms, unsure whether to believe him. "You expect me to trust someone who admitted he belongs to organized crime?" "No," Raphael shook his head gently. "I expect you to judge what I do next." He reached into his coat and carefully removed a sealed envelope before handing it toward her. Claire accepted it without opening it. Inside, she found copies of security photographs taken over several days. The first showed the same grey-jacketed visitor entering her office building. Another showed the unfamiliar vehicle she had noticed near her apartment. A third captured the man who had hurriedly reclaimed the marked city map in Brooklyn. Each image carried a date and time. None had been altered. Claire looked up slowly. "Who are these people?" Raphael answered with complete honesty. "I do not know their names yet. I only know they began searching your neighborhood the morning after we met." "Because of you?" He held her gaze. "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Because of something they mistakenly believe is connected to your address." Claire searched his face for signs of deception and found only quiet certainty. "Then tell me the truth." Raphael nodded. "That is exactly what I am trying to do." Before either of them could continue, the low hum of an approaching engine echoed from the end of the block. Raphael's attention shifted toward the intersection for only a fraction of a second before returning to Claire. She noticed the change immediately. It was the same expression she had seen inside the bookstore, the same invisible calculation hidden behind calm eyes. What she did not know was that 1 block away another vehicle had just turned onto the street, carrying someone who finally believed they had found the woman connected to the address they had been searching for all week. Claire Dawson followed Rafael Marino into the waiting sedan only after several long seconds of hesitation, driven less by trust than by the growing realization that too many impossible coincidences had begun surrounding her life. The door closed with a quiet click, shutting out the noise of midtown traffic. Inside, the atmosphere felt surprisingly ordinary. There were no dramatic conversations, no raised voices, only the soft hum of the engine and the fading glow of evening beyond lightly tinted windows. Raphael sat across from her without rushing to speak. He understood that silence sometimes carried more weight than explanations. The sedan pulled smoothly away from the curb and merged into the flow of Manhattan traffic. Claire kept the envelope of photographs on her lap, studying each image again. Every timestamp matched places she remembered visiting. Every unfamiliar face had somehow crossed her path without her noticing. She finally looked up. "If none of this started because of you, then why me?" Raphael answered carefully. "That is the question I have been trying to solve since the night we met." Claire frowned. "You are telling me that even you do not know. I know pieces. Then tell me the pieces." He nodded once. "Several days before we met, one of my companies received information that someone was quietly searching for a specific address in Brooklyn. Not a person, not a business, an address." Claire immediately remembered the old neighborhood photograph and the circles marked across the map. "My street, yes. Why? We believed it was connected to an old property dispute. Then I met you." Claire folded her arms. "Because of the umbrella." "Because when you told me where you were going, I recognized the neighborhood immediately." She stared at him. That was why you looked past me before getting into your car. Raphael did not deny it. I memorized every building on that block because I wanted to know whether the address they were searching belonged to you. Claire looked down at the photographs again, slowly connecting details that had once seemed meaningless. The flowers, the bookstore, the waterfront. You were never following me because you wanted to impress me. No, you were making sure nobody else reached me first. Yes. The honesty in his voice left little room for doubt. Claire leaned back against the leather seat, struggling to process everything she had learned. You could have told me sooner. Raphael looked out the window where evening lights reflected across the East River. Would you have believed me? She opened her mouth before quietly admitting, probably not. The sedan crossed the Manhattan Bridge as the skyline glowed beneath deep blue twilight. For the first time since entering the car, Claire noticed they were not heading toward her apartment. Where are we going? Somewhere safe enough to finish this conversation. The vehicle entered a quiet section of Brooklyn Heights before stopping beside a restored townhouse overlooking the river. It looked less like a fortress than an elegant historic residence, with warm lights glowing through tall windows and ivy climbing old brick walls. Inside, the atmosphere felt peaceful. Bookshelves lined the walls, classical music played softly in the background, and fresh coffee filled the air. Claire had expected marble floors and intimidating luxury. Instead, she found a home that seemed designed for quiet evenings rather than power. Raphael poured 2 cups of coffee before placing one in front of her. This house belonged to my grandfather, he said. He believed every difficult conversation deserved good coffee. Claire almost smiled despite herself. He sounds wiser than most people. He usually was. They sat across from each other as daylight slowly disappeared beyond the windows. Claire studied Raphael more carefully than ever before. Without expensive restaurants, crowded sidewalks, or chance encounters surrounding them, he seemed less like the mysterious stranger from the rain and more like someone carrying responsibilities that had quietly aged him beyond his years. Tell me one thing honestly, she said. Have you ever lied to me? Raphael answered immediately. About my name, no. About how I felt when you shared your umbrella, no. About wanting to protect you, no. He paused briefly. About my life, I remained silent. Claire accepted the distinction, although it did not erase the hurt. Before either of them could continue, Raphael's trusted associate entered the room, stopping just inside the doorway. He waited until Claire looked toward him before speaking. We confirmed the photographs. Raphael stood. Which ones? The man who asked for her address today works for the same private security contractor that handled redevelopment records in Brooklyn 15 years ago. Claire looked from one man to the other, confused. What does that mean? The associate placed another folder on the table. It means this has never been about you personally. Raphael slowly opened the folder, his expression hardening for the first time since Claire had met him. Inside rested an enlarged copy of the same old neighborhood photograph Claire had seen at the preservation exhibit. One small section had been circled in red. It was not her apartment building. It was the abandoned brownstone directly across the street from it. And beneath the image, someone had typed 6 words that changed everything. Original evidence location. Do not demolish. Claire Dawson stared at the enlarged photograph spread across the polished wooden table, unable to look away from the red circle surrounding the abandoned brownstone across from her apartment. She had walked past that weathered building almost every morning for nearly 3 years without giving it more than a passing glance. Its faded brick walls, boarded windows, and rusted iron staircase had simply blended into the neighborhood like countless forgotten buildings across Brooklyn. Yet someone had quietly spent weeks searching for it. Someone had questioned people, studied old maps, and even appeared at her office hoping to confirm an address connected to it. Original evidence location, Claire read softly. Evidence of what? Raphael Marino remained standing beside the table, studying the same document. That is the part we have not confirmed. His trusted associate opened another folder filled with aging property records, newspaper clippings, and architectural drawings. 15 years ago, the city planned to demolish several buildings on your block. The project was cancelled before construction began. Most records disappeared afterward. Claire slowly turned another page. Then why search now? The associate answered quietly. Because someone recently discovered those records were incomplete. Raphael folded his hands behind his back, his attention never leaving the documents. Whoever is looking believes something important was hidden before the demolition was cancelled. Claire frowned. Hidden inside the building? Possibly. She looked toward the tall windows overlooking the river. And because I happened to live across the street, they assumed I might nodded. Exactly. The realization settled heavily across the room. For the first time since meeting Raphael, Claire understood she had never been chosen because of who she was. She had simply been living beside a mystery that had quietly survived for years. The frightening part was that strangers no longer believed it was only a coincidence. Then why not tell those people they have the wrong person? She asked. Raphael met her eyes. Because they have already decided they are right. Silence lingered between them while evening settled beyond the windows. Claire looked once more at the photographs of unfamiliar vehicles, marked maps, and surveillance images that now formed a pattern impossible to dismiss. Finally, she exhaled slowly. Running away will not solve this. Raphael studied her carefully. No, if I leave my apartment, they will continue searching. Most likely, if I pretend none of this exists, they will still come back. Yes. Claire rested both hands on the edge of the table, her thoughts becoming unexpectedly clear. Then I want to know the truth. Raphael's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The truth may change your life. It already has. The answer arrived with quiet certainty instead of fear. For the first time since revealing his identity, Raphael allowed himself the smallest hint of relief. He had expected anger, rejection, or disbelief. Instead, he saw determination. Not recklessness, not curiosity, simply the refusal to let uncertainty control her future. Less than an hour later, the three of them stood inside a secure archive room beneath one of Raphael's commercial office buildings. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, holding decades of property records purchased through perfectly legal real estate transactions. Claire carefully compared architectural blueprints of her neighborhood with copies of the city planning maps she had seen earlier. After several minutes, she noticed something unusual. These measurements do not match. Raphael stepped beside her. Show me. Claire pointed toward the elevation drawing of the abandoned brownstone. The exterior dimensions are identical, but the interior wall thickness changes between the original design and the renovation plans. Raphael examined both documents. Hidden structural space. Claire nodded. Not large enough for another room, but large enough for a protected compartment. The associate looked surprised. Would anyone notice that? Claire smiled faintly. Most people would not. Architects usually do. Raphael looked at her with unmistakable admiration. You found in 5 minutes what professional investigators missed for years. Claire lowered the blueprints. Only because I was looking for buildings instead of secrets. At that exact moment, Raphael's phone vibrated once. He answered immediately, listening without interruption. His calm expression remained unchanged, but Claire noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes that always appeared when important information arrived. After ending the call, he looked directly at her. Someone entered the abandoned brownstone 20 minutes ago. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. The people searching? We believe so. She looked from Raphael to the blueprints still spread across the table. Every logical part of her mind insisted she should walk away, return to her ordinary apartment, and let someone else solve the mystery. Yet another part remembered the kindness that had begun beneath a shared umbrella, the honesty Raphael had finally chosen over silence, and the growing certainty that this story had already become part of her life, whether she welcomed it or not. She carefully rolled the architectural drawings closed before meeting Raphael's eyes with steady resolve. Raphael did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her expression, recognizing that the decision had already been made long before she spoke the words. Outside, the first drops of another evening rain began tapping softly against the windows as the forgotten brownstone across from Claire's apartment waited in silence, still guarding whatever truth had remained hidden behind its aging walls for 15 years. Rain followed them all the way back to Brooklyn, turning familiar streets into shimmering ribbons of reflected light beneath old street lamps. Claire Dawson sat quietly in the passenger seat while Raphael Marino guided the sedan through the neighborhood without unnecessary conversation. Every building outside the window looked exactly as it had the week before, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The bakery still glowed warmly on the corner. The blue mailbox still stood beside the pharmacy. Children had long since gone home, leaving the sidewalks almost empty except for the occasional pedestrian hurrying beneath an umbrella. It amazed Claire how an entire world could change while appearing exactly the same. The sedan stopped half a block away from her apartment building. Raphael switched off the engine but remained seated for a moment, studying the abandoned brownstone across the street. Its dark windows reflected only rain and distant traffic, giving no hint that anyone had entered earlier that evening. "Whatever happened here," Claire whispered, "it stayed hidden because everyone stopped looking." Raphael nodded slowly, until someone started looking again. His trusted associate stepped out first after receiving a quiet message through an earpiece. He disappeared toward the corner before returning several minutes later. "The building is empty now," he reported. Inside, Raphael opened the umbrella he had kept in the back seat and looked toward Claire. "Stay close." Together they crossed the rain-soaked street. The brownstone stood silent beneath years of neglect, its weathered brick softened by ivy and time. The front entrance had already been unlocked by the associate after confirming the building belonged to one of Raphael's real estate companies, acquired years earlier among dozens of forgotten properties scheduled for future restoration. Dust floated through flashlight beams as they stepped inside. Old hardwood floors creaked beneath careful footsteps, while faded wallpaper peeled gently away from the walls. Nothing suggested hidden treasure or dramatic secrets. Instead, the house felt like a place patiently waiting for someone to remember it. Claire slowly unfolded copies of the architectural drawings she had brought with her. She compared the measurements to the hallway stretching before them, quietly counting windows and support walls. After several minutes, she stopped near the rear staircase. "The dimensions shift here," she said softly. Raphael joined her. "You are certain?" She nodded. "There should be another 18 inches behind this wall." Raphael's associate examined the surface carefully before discovering a narrow wooden panel concealed beneath decades of paint. It opened without force, revealing a slim compartment protected from moisture by heavy metal lining. Inside rested a weathered document case tied with faded blue ribbon. No jewelry, no cash, no valuables, only papers. Claire looked at Raphael in surprise. Someone protected documents for 15 years. Raphael carefully lifted the case and placed it on a nearby table. The ribbon crumbled gently as he untied it. Inside rested property agreements, handwritten correspondence, engineering reports, and a sealed envelope marked with the logo of a long-defunct city redevelopment office. Claire unfolded the first engineering report and immediately recognized signatures from preservation architects whose work she had studied in graduate school. "These people argued against demolishing the neighborhood," she said. Raphael continued reading another document. "Because they discovered the redevelopment proposal had been approved using altered inspection records." Claire looked up. The buildings were never unsafe. No. He placed another page beside the first. Someone wanted the entire block cleared for a private acquisition. The remaining documents completed the story piece by piece. Years earlier, several respected architects, engineers, and community leaders had uncovered errors that prevented an unnecessary demolition project from moving forward. Rather than allowing the evidence to disappear, they quietly stored certified copies inside the hidden compartment until proper legal review could take place. Before that review ever happened, the project collapsed for unrelated financial reasons. The neighborhood survived, and the forgotten evidence remained untouched inside the wall. Claire slowly exhaled. Nobody was searching for money. Raphael shook his head. They were searching for proof. His associate carefully photographed every document before sealing them inside protective folders. "The redevelopment company no longer exists," he observed, "but several successor firms are still operating." Raphael nodded. "Which explains why someone suddenly became interested again." Claire looked around the quiet brownstone with renewed understanding. The mystery had never belonged to organized crime. It belonged to history, greed, and a decision made long before she moved into the neighborhood. She turned toward Raphael. "You protected me because you thought they might believe I knew about this." "Yes, even though I did not. They were searching addresses, not facts. I could not risk them reaching the wrong conclusion first." Claire remembered every coincidence that no longer felt accidental. The flowers, the bookstore, the waterfront, the quiet conversations. None of them had been attempts to control her life. They had been careful efforts to keep her safe without frightening her before he understood the danger himself. She smiled sadly. "You carried this alone because you thought the truth would scare me away." Raphael met her eyes. "I was afraid it would." Claire looked once more at the forgotten documents resting beneath the beam of a flashlight. Then she gently reached for the umbrella leaning beside the doorway, still damp from the rain outside. "The truth did not scare me away," she said quietly. The silence almost did. At that exact moment, the associate's phone vibrated with a final update. After reading the message, he looked toward Raphael with visible relief. The city agreed to secure the records first thing tomorrow morning. The search is over. Outside, the rain began to ease, and for the first time since a stranger had stepped beneath a shared umbrella, the uncertainty that had quietly followed Claire through every street in New York finally began to disappear. The following morning arrived brighter than any day Claire Dawson could remember since the storm that had first placed a stranger beneath her umbrella. Sunlight poured across Brooklyn's brownstones, catching freshly washed sidewalks and the golden leaves drifting from old maple trees. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, yet a quiet sense of relief lingered in the air, as though the streets themselves had finally released a breath they had been holding for years. City officials arrived shortly after sunrise to secure the recovered records, accompanied by preservation specialists and legal archivists who carefully documented every page discovered inside the hidden compartment. Claire watched from across the street with a cup of coffee warming her hands while neighbors gathered in small groups, curious about the unexpected activity surrounding the abandoned building. Nobody spoke dramatically, nobody created rumors. Most simply assumed another forgotten property was finally being restored. In many ways, that assumption was true. It was not only an old building being restored, it was the truth. By noon, the historical documents had already been transferred to official custody, and the city publicly announced that previously overlooked redevelopment records would undergo a complete legal review. Several organizations connected to the old demolition proposal immediately released statements promising full cooperation. The quiet search that had shadowed Claire's life for days ended almost as quietly as it had begun. Without hidden evidence left to recover, there was no longer any reason for strangers to circle her neighborhood asking questions. For the first time in more than a week, Claire walked home without noticing unfamiliar vehicles or wondering whether every coincidence carried another secret. Late that afternoon, she found Rafael Marino standing outside the neighborhood bakery where they had unknowingly crossed paths countless times. He was dressed simply in a dark wool coat, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. There were no waiting associates nearby, no black sedan parked beside the curb, and no sense of urgency surrounding him. He looked less like the powerful businessman the newspapers occasionally whispered about, and more like the quiet stranger she had met during the rain. "I thought you might be here," Claire said as she approached. Raphael handed her one of the coffees. "I hoped you would." They began walking without deciding on a destination. The familiar streets suddenly felt different now that neither of them carried unanswered questions between them. Children played basketball in a nearby schoolyard while bicycles rolled slowly along tree-lined sidewalks. Ordinary life had returned, and Claire realized how extraordinary ordinary life could feel after uncertainty finally disappeared. "The city thanked the preservation architects this morning," she said. "Most of them are retired now." Raphael nodded. "They deserved that recognition years ago." Claire looked toward the restored brick buildings lining the block. One decision protected an entire neighborhood. Sometimes the quiet decisions matter the most. She smiled because the words reminded her of another quiet decision made beneath a single umbrella. They reached the small community park overlooking the East River, where ferries crossed the water beneath a sky filled with soft afternoon light. Claire stopped beside the railing and looked across the Manhattan skyline. "Can I ask one last question?" Raphael rested his hands in the pockets of his coat. "Anything," she turned toward him. "If I had never shared that umbrella, would you still have protected me?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the river for several thoughtful seconds before speaking with complete honesty. "Yes." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Even if we had never spoken, yes." "Why?" Raphael smiled gently. The guarded expression that had followed him for so many years finally giving way to something lighter. "Because you would still have been an innocent person standing in the middle of someone else's mistake." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly laughing. "And here I thought it was only about kindness." "It began with kindness," he replied. "Everything after that became a choice." His answer settled gently between them, needing nothing more. Claire realized that throughout the entire week, Raphael had never once asked her to trust his reputation. He had only asked her to judge his actions. Looking back, every important answer had been there from the beginning. He had thanked her instead of impressing her. He had protected her without demanding anything in return. He had finally told the truth even though he believed it might cost him the one friendship he valued most. Those choices mattered far more than labels attached to his life. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening as they continued walking through streets that no longer carried hidden danger. Across the neighborhood, construction crews quietly placed protective fencing around the abandoned brownstone in preparation for its long-overdue restoration. Claire smiled as she watched workers carefully preserve every original brick instead of tearing the building down. Somehow it felt like the perfect ending for a mystery built around saving something others had forgotten was worth protecting. As the sun settled lower across the skyline, Raphael looked toward Claire with quiet sincerity. "There is one thing I never said because I wanted you to discover it for yourself." She met his eyes. "What is that?" He smiled with the same calm warmth she had first noticed beneath the rain. "You changed far more than your own future the day you decided to stop for a stranger. You reminded me that strength means very little if it forgets compassion." Claire looked toward the river, realizing that sometimes the smallest moments truly became the ones that changed everything. 1 month later, the neighborhood looked different without losing what had always made it feel like home. Fresh scaffolding surrounded the old brownstone, but every original brick remained carefully protected beneath restoration netting instead of demolition barriers. Historic preservation signs replaced faded warning notices, and curious visitors occasionally stopped to read about the architects and community leaders whose forgotten work had finally received the recognition it deserved. Claire Dawson often paused there on her walk home from the architecture firm, smiling each time she watched skilled craftsmen repairing history instead of erasing it. The city had officially declared the recovered records authentic, ending years of uncertainty surrounding the abandoned redevelopment project. The remaining legal questions belonged to historians, preservation experts, and public officials now that the evidence had been secured. Claire's life gradually returned to familiar rhythms. Mornings began with coffee from the neighborhood bakery, long hours spent designing buildings that respected the past while welcoming the future, and evenings filled with quiet walks through streets she no longer viewed with suspicion. Yet one important part of her routine had changed forever. Rafael Marino no longer appeared unexpectedly like a coincidence hidden inside the city. Instead, he simply called before visiting, arrived when he promised, and left only after asking whether she wanted company a little longer. The mystery between them had disappeared, replaced by something much rarer. Trust built one honest conversation at a time. One Saturday afternoon they visited the restored waterfront park, where they had once shared an ordinary walk filled with extraordinary questions. Autumn had painted the trees with shades of gold and crimson, while families spread blankets across the grass and children laughed beneath the clear blue sky. Claire carried a sketchbook once again, stopping occasionally to capture details of old buildings reflected across the river. Raphael watched quietly as she worked, resisting the temptation to interrupt the peaceful concentration she always found while drawing. "You know," Claire said after finishing another page, "I used to think architecture was only about buildings." Raphael looked toward the skyline, and now she closed the sketchbook with a thoughtful smile. "Now I think it is really about protecting stories before people forget them." He nodded gently. "That sounds familiar." They continued walking until dark clouds slowly gathered beyond the Hudson. A cool breeze carried the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Around them, people began packing picnic baskets and folding lawn chairs while the first distant rumble of thunder echoed beyond the skyline. Claire looked upward and laughed softly. "Looks like history enjoys repeating itself." Raphael reached into the back seat of his car parked nearby before returning with a familiar navy umbrella. Time had left a few small scratches on the handle, but Claire recognized it immediately. It was the same umbrella she had carried on the night their lives unexpectedly crossed. She accepted it with a surprised smile. "You kept it?" Raphael looked almost embarrassed. "You left it in my car that evening." Claire laughed. "I thought I had lost it. I hoped one day I could return it properly." The first gentle drops of rain touched the sidewalk as she opened the umbrella above them both. Once again they stood beneath the same small circle of shelter while the city continued moving around them. This time there was no uncertainty, no hidden identity, no unanswered question waiting in the silence. Only two people who had chosen to remain beside each other after every secret had already been revealed. Claire looked at Raphael with the easy confidence that only truth could create. "Do you know what I finally realized?" "What? That you never remembered my address because you wanted to find me?" Raphael smiled softly. "No," she shook her head. "You remembered it because you wanted to make sure I could always make it home." He held her gaze for several quiet seconds before answering. "And now, Claire slipped her hand gently into his. Now home feels a little bigger than one address. They walked slowly through the rain toward the neighborhood that had unknowingly brought their lives together, passing the restored brownstone where workers had already uncovered beautiful original stonework hidden beneath years of neglect. It reminded Claire that some things were never truly broken. They simply waited for someone patient enough to uncover what had always been there. As evening settled across Brooklyn, warm lights appeared inside apartment windows one by one while rain shimmered softly beneath old street lamps. The umbrella sheltered them just as it had on the very first night, but nothing else was the same. The stranger had become someone she trusted. The mystery had become history. Fear and the smallest act of kindness, offered without expectation on a rainy New York evening, had quietly rewritten two futures that neither of them could have imagined. Long after the rain stopped, the umbrella remained open above them as they disappeared together down the familiar sidewalk, no longer walking toward uncertainty, but toward a life they had both chosen with open eyes and honest hearts.